Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time you may be watching or listening, and welcome to the Carving It Up U.S. President's Edition. This is unbelievable, man. We are in episode 8. It's a 10-part series. We're on episode 8, and we're going to be covering 4 presidents today, and then the next episode, we're going to cover the last 4. We got 8 presidents left, so today, we're going to do Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and then finally Bill Clinton. And obviously in the next episode, we'll cover the final 4 presidents. So before I bring on my co-host, Isaac Lawson, who's been with me throughout the duration of this series, sort of where we are in America at this point. We're in 1976, and the country has been through it for the past 3 decades. End of World War II, you've got the Cold War, you've got you got tensions of Vietnam, you've got the Kennedy assassination, you've got Richard Nixon resigns. I mean, it seems like it's one thing after another that the country around 1976 is sort of losing its trust in its leader. And so that's kind of where a very little known politician from the state of Georgia, comes around and becomes president. But before we get into that, let's bring on my man, Isaac Lawson. Isaac, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. It's great to be back.
It's great to have you back on here. And, sort of what's your takeaway? Like my thing is, this is a very tumultuous 2-3 decades for America. Where do you think the country is in terms of its morale and its sort of where it's at right now at this point?
Yeah, I feel like we kind of see both extremes in this era. We're going to see, points where the country is feeling really confident about the future and about the direction that it's going in. And then there are also going to be times where the public is very pessimistic and, feels like they're kind of directionless and that they need a course correction. We're going to see that more than once in this episode while we discuss these 4 presidents. And, another interesting thing that I was thinking about for this era is that, we're seeing where we're once again in kind of a time of change, but this time it's a global change and not a national change. The U.S., there are things that change in the country, but that's not where the primary kind of turmoil is. It's more with the Cold War and the end of the Cold War and kind of the global order, which I think is interesting and shows a shift, not just in the state of the world, but in the state of the country.
That's well said, because I was going to ask you, what you, because I've asked you, each episode, what do you think the listeners should, expect in this episode? But that is the case, is we see different changes around the world that the U.S. is involved in, whether it's war, whether it's, obviously we'll talk about, of course, the Berlin Wall and General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, but that's another conversation for later in this episode. But so again, we come around the election of 1976, and you put it perfectly. America is very pessimistic at this point in time, and they decide to go with the governor of Georgia, a man named Jimmy Carter, who promised that he would never tell a lie to the American people. He came off as very down to earth, honest. And I think given the scandals, especially of Watergate, I think, that was sort of what appealed to where America was at the time. But what's your takeaways on Jimmy Carter and why the country decided to go with him in 1976?
He, even when you go back and kind of watch things from that election, he is a politician, but he, isn't a politician. Like, his demeanor, the way that he talks about things is very honest, and it feels very honest. And like, he's not trying to put up a front to people to kind of view him a certain way, that he is just being Jimmy Carter. And I think that was something that people really appealed to. I think people sometimes forget the 1976 election was decently close. Ford put up a good fight. But, Carter's kind of charming demeanor, I think his honesty really shone through. And I think just the message of, this hasn't been working. These people lied to you. We need kind of a course correction to kind of restore that kind of moral heart of America. Was something that really worked for his campaign. And I think that he gave people hope that he would be able to kind of restore that faith and trust that they felt like had been lost.
Yeah, and I think that not all of it was just the fact that Jimmy Carter was an honest man, because as we talked about in the
Mhm.
last episode, Gerald Ford had that exact same reputation. It
Yes.
was the fact that Carter was, a quote unquote Washington outsider. And that's, I think, what appealed to the country, above all.
Mhm.
So we move on to our 39th president of the United States, the first one of this episode, Jimmy Carter. Number 39, Jimmy Carter, Democrat. 1977 to 1981. 52 years old, from Georgia. So Jimmy Carter takes office. He was born on October the 1st of 1924 to Jimmy Carter Sr. and Bessie Gardy, and he married Rosalind Smith in 1946. They had 4 children together. And right from the get-go, he sort of symbolized, again, going back to he is a different president, because he takes the oath of office in 1977, and rather than riding in a motorcade in the inaugural parade, he did basically what Thomas Jefferson did in 1801. He walked the route from the Capitol to the White House, again, sort of putting off this "I'm one of you" sort of vibe. So, talk about his, I guess, personality and what he was like, his demeanor as president.
Jimmy Carter really is like a what you see is what you get kind of guy. He is very friendly. He really likes people. He wants to make people kind of feel seen and heard, and that can be seen in his life as a politician, or even in his post presidency, where he has taught Sunday school at his church for several decades.
Yeah.
It's something that's very consistent. I've met a number of people who've met Jimmy Carter, sometimes in more formal settings, sometimes just like running into him somewhere. And he has always, like, consistently, I've heard he's very friendly, he's very kind, he will stop and talk to you. And, I think that, again, just kind of goes what you're saying, that there is kind of a uniqueness here, that he is kind of a normal person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I feel like that definitely plays into, especially the beginning of his presidency, because he wants to be so engaged with the public in a way that most presidents, I think, kind of understandably don't want to. That I feel like it does kind of like throw people off in a good way. And it makes them feel seen and heard the way that he wants them to feel seen and heard. Eventually, I think that kind of backfires on him, but we'll get there. We're not there yet.
Well, that's the thing. You sort of touched on it. Is there are a number of issues in his 4 years in office that, again, we will touch on. But I will say, and I think he was very he was a very virtuous man, a very smart man, and most, if not all, and I mean, that, I guess we can have this debate another day. Most, if not all, presidents have been religious in some way.
Mm-hmm.
But Jimmy Carter is one of a small group that every decision he made was based off of his faith. And I think, look, his presidency was at times extremely shaky, to say the very least. But I think it's safe to say he is one of the truly good men who have occupied that office. But as you mentioned, it sort of does come back to bite him in some ways, at least later in his term. But he kind of micromanaged the White House agenda. He worked long hours throughout the day. But again, the platform that he used to get elected sort of caused the majority of his problems. He didn't like the quote unquote political games that many in Congress would play. And so at times he would sort of refuse to get along with them. He didn't, wasn't necessarily a man of compromise with the House and with the Senate. And so outside of adding cabinet posts for, energy and for education, this sort of mentality hurt Carter's domestic agenda. As you sort of touched on at the beginning of the show, this is going to be a very, domestically, the country doesn't make as many strides as it has maybe like in the previous episode. But it was sort of on the world stage where he made his mark. He made it clear that human rights would be the core of his agenda. So, talk about that and his, and we'll talk about his post presidency, later on. But how much he valued human rights, but also at times how he, didn't necessarily get along with those in the House and in the Senate.
He has a quote that I've heard from him several times, and I have like kind of engraved on one of the walls of his presidential library. And it's actually him quoting scripture where he talks about blessed are the peacemakers. And he had said several times that his goal during his presidency was to be a peacemaker, and that he thought that war was evil, and that that's what he was called to as a believer, and that as a politician, that is what he could accomplish. And he very proudly, even now, will say, there were no wars while I was president. We did not engage in military conflict while I was president, and there was peace. And I think that that says a lot about his kind of goal with foreign policy was to create peace. And, in a lot of ways, he was successful, even when it was very controversial. I think of the Camp David Accords, which I'm pretty sure we'll probably talk about. Although I feel like most people are fairly familiar with them. He worked to try to engage in human rights and be able to promote human rights in a way that was going to be sustainable on the world stage. It was also going to actually get movement, because lots of times we run into the issue where, a country is kind of like, authoritarian, and they're oppressing their citizens or different, populations. And there's not really that much we can do about it unless we go invade, and you can't do that in every scenario. So I think Carter really kind of pushed to try to find ways to be able to intervene and be able to speak and get results on behalf of these people without
bloodshed,
engaging in military conflict.
Right, absolutely. And again, the Camp David Accords, as you mentioned, you led right into where I was going next. That was really core of what he was about. It sort of perfectly signifies what Jimmy Carter was about. Carter had brokered a deal between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister, forgive me if I'm saying his name incorrectly, Begin, I know is his last name. But Carter took on the role as peacemaker in the Middle East, and he kind of ignored advice from the American press, from his advisors. He sort of was going off of his gut, and he himself sort of felt a higher calling to get this deal done. He himself said that he had, being, a man of the Bible, had read obviously about conflicts in the Middle East that had been going on for, hundreds and hundreds of years. And, he wanted to sort of be the peacemaker. But while getting Sadat and Begin to sit in a room together was unbelievably difficult. Getting them to agree on anything seemed nearly impossible. For the first 3 days of this, nothing productive was accomplished. It was basically nothing but the two foreign leaders taking shots at one another, making certain remarks. And so talk about at least the beginning of the Camp David Accords, and how, it almost fell apart.
No, it really seemed like it was going to be a disaster at first, because, these are two countries that had been at war on and off since Israel's, conception as a nation. And it was unrealistic. It was something that people did not think was going to happen, that there would be able to be peace between these countries. And these two world leaders did not get along. They did not want to sit down and talk to each other. And Carter definitely leaned into kind of his power on the world stage as president of the United States to be able to kind of push both of them into the room together and try to create that dialogue. And like you said, it almost did fall apart. They fought incessantly. There were times where they would have meetings, and one of the other leaders would just walk out of the meeting and would basically start to make plans to just leave. And Carter would then go to them and kind of have to beg them to come back and try again. But, he was persistent, and, a lot of this was kind of behind the scenes. It wasn't seen by the public. So they didn't really know, but the whole time everyone's kind of watching this, and kind of a general perception is, one, it's crazy that these people are even in a room together. And then two, this is going to be a disaster. But, Carter, I think a lot through persistence, and I think just through the fact that he kind of, I think in a lot of ways, has kind of embodied peacefulness, or at least tried to. I think that he set an example for them that I feel like both of them kind of couldn't fight with him about this, if that makes sense. He wasn't really going to take no for an answer. And he was able to get both of those leaders to kind of see each other differently and be able to kind of soften their views of each other, which was essential to get a peace deal through.
It was, and that's you hit on it. Carter was unbelievably persistent throughout these negotiations. In fact, there was actually one moment where Begin is about to walk out of the room, and is
Mhm.
like you said, making plans to leave Maryland. And Carter comes in and says, "No, you are not leaving. We are going to, come to some sort of compromise." And the peace accord, the process took 13 days, but finally Carter persuaded Sadat and Begin to agree on a framework for peace. And I think it's safe to say the signing of the Camp David Accords was without a question the high point of Carter's presidency.
Yes.
And the country certainly was very receptive of this, and I think everybody was very receptive of it. Unfortunately, the sort of celebratory mood of this was short-lived, because 4 months later, an energy and economic crisis was building that
Mhm.
absolutely sent Carter's approval rating plummeting. Because at this point, you had the inflation of 1979. It sends gas prices sky high. It drove consumer prices up. Obviously, Carter himself didn't cause the inflation, but the biggest issue for him is, and what became known as sort of his malaise speech.
Mhm.
He sort of almost put off a persona. Yes, he was being honest, but it almost, for some people, came off as he's blaming the people for the problem.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
Again, there was a perception that this was a truly good man who was just in over his head. But sort of the malaise speech, if you will, it is kind of a sort of time period with, again, gas prices are going high. You have obviously, Jimmy Carter is extremely, again, a good man who wanted to do right by the people. And I think through this speech, he's sort of trying to make a point of like, hey, it is a crisis of confidence. That was sort of the famous line from that speech. And but his sort of view of it was flawed in the way that, hey, the people don't necessarily want to hear from the president, hey, we have something to do with this. Now, you could argue that, hey, John F. Kennedy once said, ask not what, your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. But Kennedy and Carter were different. And we're going to see, obviously, with Carter's successor. Kennedy and Carter were different in that Kennedy was a brilliant communicator, as was, again, Carter's successor. And again, that this, I would say, in my opinion, is the biggest reason that Carter would go on to lose re-election in 1980. But I think Jimmy Carter is sort of, he's trying to convey a message of unity, of confidence. But it sort of falls through in a lot of ways because the gas prices are high. People are struggling to pay the bills, if you will. Again, consumer prices are high. And President Carter is sort of in a very weird dynamic where, okay, how do I convey this message? And it was a message that I'm not sure, excuse me, that he was well equipped to, to sort of convey, if you will. But I think at the end of the day, that was sort of the problem with the speech is not that his honesty was the issue. Again, Jimmy Carter's honesty was probably his greatest trait, but it was how he delivered it that I think the people had a problem with. But again, as bad as this was, as bad as the inflation of 1979 was, an even greater crisis was brewing, because in October of 1979, Islamic militants stormed the American embassy in Iran and took 52 American hostages. Now, Carter resisted calls for a swift military response, as he preferred the slower path of diplomacy. He believed that if he started bombing Iran, that the lives of the hostages would be at risk. And so this is a very scary and tumultuous year and a half for Jimmy Carter. And it's a very, and for the country in general, and of course, obviously for the hostages, the families, the loved ones of the hostages. And so, if there was ever, I think, a president who could deal with this again, as Isaac mentioned, without, a military response, I would say Jimmy Carter would probably be pretty close to the top of that list. He was certainly a man of peace. And, so Isaac, talk about, are you back in the room?
Yes, I am. Sorry about that.
Awesome. No, don't worry about it, man. Talk about this crisis of the hostages in Iran, and how Jimmy Carter deals with it, for the next basically year and a half.
So Carter's plan was basically to try to negotiate with them to get their release. And that was not popular for a number of reasons. One was because there was kind of a view that was like, these people are targeting Americans. They don't share our values. They're in a country that was not like widely known by the public. So that's kind of added sense to this. It's not like France or even a Japan, somewhere that the public is like familiar with at the time, especially. Just kind of this like exotic place. And they just feel like he's not willing to kind of stand up for these people, is what it kind of boils down to. Is instead of being like he's trying to do it in a way that, is probably going to be safest for the hostages and is going to stop there from being like a war and all that, they're just kind of viewing it as he's not willing to go send the military to go help these people. He doesn't really care enough to go send the military to help these people. And then there's also a sense the longer it kind of drags out while he's going through the peace process, there's also this idea that boils up that, well, they don't respect him enough to let these people go. So, though that kind of mix of ideas kind of helps to kind of hurt his public image, because you have on one sense this view where it's like, well, this world leader of this country, they don't care what the president of the United States thinks. That's on him, because they should care. It's kind of the public's view. And then on the other side, they also are looking at him and they're saying, do you not care about these people? Like, this could be done. You could have sent in the military and these people could be out of there by now, which again is debatable in reality. But it's that's kind of the mix reaction that it gets. And the longer it drags on, and when he does send in the mission finally to free the hostages and it fails, it again just leaves people sitting there looking like either you waited too long to send in the military, or you didn't know how to like lead the military in a way that could have gotten these people out. So kind of all his options there and all the different ways he's trying to handle this crisis results in people kind of looking at him and being like, you don't really care, or you don't know what you're doing. And that just really hurts him. And then, when there's political attacks against that from his opponents, especially in 1980 in the election year, that's exactly what they say. They either say he's not respected on the world stage, they either say he doesn't care enough to send the military in, or they say he doesn't know how to send the military in a way that's effective. And all three of those make him look weak. So even with like the success of something like the Camp David Accords, where it's, very big and very public and is kind of unimaginable, that success kind of quickly goes away in the public's mind, because here's a little country that most of us don't really know about, which is kind of like I'm using air quotes there.
Yeah.
And he can't get them to like respect him. So why should we?
Sure. And I think, the issue again for Jimmy Carter was not that he didn't care. And I think, and I heard him say about, I saw a thing a few years ago. He talked about, he could have bombed Iran like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it wouldn't have been, any sort of big thing for him to do that. But his mentality was, anything that puts the hostages at risk, I'm just not going to do. Anything that will put their lives in danger, I'm not going to do that. And again, the inflation, the hostages, it all just comes tumbling down into what is just, a complete downward spiral for Jimmy Carter in his last year and a half in office. And of course, it, as you mentioned, obviously they tried in April of 1980 to rescue these hostages. That failed. And so, the 1980 election actually happened to be held, I believe, on the 1-year anniversary of the taking of the hostages.
Mm-hmm.
And so, adding to Jimmy Carter's problems was the fact that he lost in one of the biggest election landslides in history to the charismatic governor of California, Ronald Reagan. And so Jimmy Carter loses in 1980. He's going to be out of the White House in 2 months. And so he dedicates the last 2 months of his presidency to getting the hostages out, like negotiating and staying up, working long hours, staying up late at night, trying to get these 52 people out of here.
Mm-hmm.
And as a matter of fact, excuse me, as Ronald Reagan was being sworn in, reportedly the hostages are still, in captivity. But Jimmy Carter was then told, as Reagan is being sworn in on the reviewing stand, that all 52 hostages are on a plane about ready to come home. And it's sort of I guess a running joke. Not sure if there's much truth to it, but it's sort of a running joke that the hostages release was delayed to hurt Carter's reelection bid. I don't believe that personally, just for the simple fact, excuse me, that I don't think Jimmy Carter stood much of a chance anyway, just because of how it all did go down. But just talk about the 1980 election, why the country overwhelmingly was behind Reagan as opposed to Carter. And then the following events that finally, thank God, led to the freedom of the 52 American hostages.
I think for the 1980 election, I think that a lot of it had to do with, even though Carter and Reagan were both working really hard to strike an optimistic tone about the future of the country, Reagan had, kind of a little bit easier of a leg to stand on because Carter was already in office. So people were kind of looking at him and saying, okay, if there's all these problems, why don't you just fix them all now? And that's not always a fair thing to say. And I don't think that a lot of the problems in Carter's presidency, I think he had some problems in some of his reactions, which I missed it, like the Malaise speech.
Yeah.
That's one where, his reaction could have been better. But that's what he had kind of trouble justifying was, well, I am making it better, but people weren't seeing those results. So, Reagan kind of had that to be able to stand on to kind of push him out of office with, again, two pretty charismatic guys. They were both well liked, and he was just able to kind of be optimistic, but also be able to say, well, we don't know what my results are going to be. We do know what Carter's are going to be. And that's kind of how he was able to kind of drive public opinion away from Carter. Now for the hostages release, I'm not sure about the delay in like just getting them released, period. I think that's kind of hard to tell. And it's hard to tell, especially in any situation like that, like kind of what they're going to need to kind of let those people go. And like, even all the documents on that aren't public yet. So we don't even know probably the whole story. But I think, definitely the symbolism in them flying back right after Reagan is sworn in as president, that's something that in my mind is without a doubt they were trying to hurt Carter's reputation, as kind of one last kind of jab at him. And maybe them thinking maybe we can get a little bit friendlier with the new administration coming in, because we kind of helped them out politically, but also ended this crisis. So I think that's definitely interesting. And even now, that's something that people still bring up is, well, the hostages didn't come back until Reagan was president. Which again, Reagan deserves no credit for that whatsoever. He was not a part of any of those talks. Right. But that is something that I don't think will, in my opinion, will ever really be remembered by the public as something that was because of Carter's foreign policy. I don't think that he will be remembered for the release of those hostages.
Yeah, and that look, it's sort of another example of of presidential history where, maybe history itself is favorable to you, but maybe the public perception is not. And so, excuse me, it's sort of what plays out again over the last 2 months of his presidency. But Jimmy Carter leaves the White House. He goes back to Georgia, and for the past 40 plus years has embarked on an absolutely remarkable post-presidential run. You have obviously the Carter Center and things on from there. And in 2002, as a matter of fact, 2 decades after leaving office, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And in this, and plenty of ex-presidents, well, I wouldn't say plenty, a decent number of ex-presidents had done, humanitarian work. But Jimmy Carter took it to a whole new level that I think set the standard for presidents to follow. I think when you see if we think about today's modern presidents, if we think about, say, George W. Bush or Barack Obama and their efforts, I think that comes from Jimmy Carter, and I think he deserves a ton of credit for that. So talk about his post-presidential life. One that's, look, say what you want about the problems of his presidency. I think his post-presidential life has been outstanding.
I think, in one way, I think it's definitely highlighted just the sincerity of his character, that he, is someone that, whether he was in public office or not, was going to be serving people and was going to be, promoting peace and kind of promoting the betterment of the world. Just the work that he's done through the Carter Center to help get vaccines out to people in countries that have less developed economies and things like that, it is really admirable. And I think, he, the Carter Center does a lot of stuff. I mentioned the vaccines, but they also will send up election observers to go observe elections in kind of new democracies. And even they have a election observers here in the U.S. and in other countries around the world that are, kind of considered the kind of solid democracies. He also, I think it's notable enough to say that, up well into his 90s until before COVID, he was participating in a Habitat for Humanity house build once a year. He and his wife, those are things that are crazy. It's crazy for any 90-year-old to be participating in that, but it just says something about who Jimmy Carter is. That's just consistent. Him teaching Sunday school for decades. He is someone who I think undeniable is one of the best men to have ever been president. And he's someone that I think should be an inspiration for people around the country and going forward in years to come, as someone who is an example of what it means to be a public servant. It doesn't necessarily mean being a politician. It doesn't necessarily mean being president, but it means serving the community around you, regardless of how big that community is, in any way that you possibly can. And I think it's hard to deny that Jimmy Carter doesn't have a genuine love for people. It doesn't have a genuine love for the country. And I think that's why, in this post-presidency, his approval rating has been really high. People view him very favorably. And it's because, he does care about people.
100%. I think you hit it. I think you hit the nail on the head. That we forget oftentimes. Certainly, I think it's safe to say today's politicians do, but I think even at times we, the public, forget that they are, at the end of the day, at least, supposed to be public servants. And, again, like you said, nobody exhibited this more than Jimmy Carter, where, and he has been active in politics since then. He has spoken about certain things, but more than that, actually doing the work. I've heard a wise man once say, don't talk about it, be about it. And Jimmy Carter's been about it, his entire, these last 4 decades post-presidency. And as of this recording, and certainly biggest knock on wood in this series, as of this recording, he's the oldest president the oldest man to have been president. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that.
Yes.
Yes. The longest lived president in American history. He is, as it stands today, I believe he's 97 years old, or 97 years young, considering, the work that he is still doing to this very day.
He's also the longest married president.
Yes.
I'm trying to remember how many years he and Rosalind have been married.
They got married in 1946, so that's 70. They just celebrated their 75th wedding anniversary. So that's, again, it's another credit to Mr. or Mrs. Carter, and again, their public service to the country, but also, their devotion to one another, which is, nothing but admirable in my view. So we move on from Jimmy Carter to a man who has become certainly one of the more popular presidents, I think certainly at the time that he was in office, Ronald Reagan. Number 40, Ronald Reagan, Republican, 1981 to 1989, 69 years old, from California. So Ronald Reagan takes office in 1981. He was born on February the 6th of 1911 to Jack and Nellie Reagan. He married Jane Wyman in 1940. They had 3 children together. However, they divorced 9 years later in 1949. And he would remarry a woman named Nancy Davis, and they had 2 children together. And so, at the time, and I talked about Jimmy Carter was the longest lived president. At the time, Ronald Reagan was the oldest man to ever be elected president. And at 69, nearing 70 years of age. And he was known as, obviously he's most best known as the Great Communicator. Again, when we talk about some of the great orators who have been president, if you will, Reagan's certainly in the top, I would say 3, 4, with Lincoln, with names like that. So talk about Ronald Reagan and how he was sort of received around the country, especially, once he took office.
I think kind of that image that was kind of cultivated in his acting career of kind of this like cool guy, because that's kind of, who he was. Even though he was in a lot of comedies, like the one with the monkey, folks at home can Google that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yes. He carried that image for the rest of his life as someone who was cool, and then he was able to kind of portray a relatability that helped him, and he was very, very charismatic. I don't know. I would assume most people have probably seen some clip of Reagan at some point, but his acting career, obviously helps him on camera, but he is just a great orator. Like he is someone that you could seriously listen to talk for hours, because his delivery is beautiful. His jokes are humorous. They're funny, and he is just someone that was able to. I think he was able to make people feel seen better than Carter was, and I think it's because, in my opinion, he actually kept a little bit of distance between him and the public. I think that removing the presidency a little bit from kind of the people, because Carter really wanted direct communication, and Reagan wasn't. It's not that he was against that, it's just that wasn't his style. And I think that kind of made him, by elevating the presidency a little bit and still having that kind of clear communication to the people, he was able to kind of make people feel like he cared and heard them and saw them, but was also delivering results. And one of the main points of his, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit here.
No, go ahead.
One of his points in his television addresses and things was he would sit down and literally pull out the charts or whatever and talk about how successful everything he was doing was. And sometimes that was critiqued, but he did it in a way that didn't seem kind of like narcissistic bragging, but did it in a way that was like, here, I'm showing you, like, this is my progress report. And I think that made people feel kind of comfortable with him and just like, I don't know, seen and heard, and that things were progressing. And that was something that I feel like Carter struggled with, was not making people feel seen and heard, but making them, I don't know, following up with that, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. And again, that was where his greatest gift was. And you mentioned, I forgot to mention, he was a pretty well-known actor in the 1940s and 50s. And before getting into politics, I believe he was his first sort of position of leadership and power was he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He would later become, of course, the governor of California. If I'm not mistaken, he ran for president in 1968. I believe he had a debate with Robert F. Kennedy at that point. So again, he was a man who was very active in politics, and as we'll sort of see, he sort of was I would say at least the first since Calvin Coolidge to really embody what it meant to be a conservative in America. Like I think that's sort of what he was. And again, he had some big goals, big dreams. Coming into the White House. They were almost dashed 2 months into his presidency, because on March the 30th, of 1981, he gave a speech at the Washington Hilton Hotel. Reagan exited the building, waved to the crowd who was standing there watching, and almost simultaneously, a man named John Hinckley fired 6 shots at the president. Only the last of these 6 shots made contact with Reagan as it ricocheted off the armor side of the limousine into the car and into the president's left underarm, resting less than an inch from his heart. I mean, it came that close. And, the assassination attempt was unbelievably traumatic, obviously, for the president, for people watching, for the country as a whole. And, it's said that Reagan seemed fine in the car. They didn't know he had been hit. And I believe he started coughing up blood. And so that's when they rushed him to the hospital. His knees sort of gave out, and they were genuinely scared for his life. But thankfully, he pulled through. And I think the assassination attempt on Reagan and how he pulled through, he had the famous line when he was going in for surgery. He told the doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans." And I believe that the lead surgeon said, we're all Republicans, sir." And I think what that did was, I think the country saw that, at least maybe those who were a little more skeptical, like, hey, this is a tough hombre, he stared down an assassin's bullet and was able to pull through, thankfully. And so talk about that whole situation and how it developed, and how, again, thankfully, the president was able to pull through.
I want to say one more story about a joke he told after his assassination attempt. Nancy Reagan, gets to the hospital, and I'm trying to remember if it was before he went into surgery. I think it was they had just finished their first surgery on him, and he was kind of coming out of it, but it was still very unsure what was going to happen. But, Nancy came over to him and held his hand and, was talking to him, and he looked at her and said, "Nancy?" And she said, "Yes, Ron." And he said, "I forgot to duck." And that was very, like, that kind of joking humorism, even it comes out, multiple times in his assassination attempt. And it's just interesting to see, that consistency in Reagan's personality. And his jokes are funny. It's my favorite thing about his speeches. This assassination attempt did change the way people viewed Reagan, because he wasn't viewed as necessarily being like this great leader yet. And part of that was because he had just entered office. Right. But part of it too was, lingering from Watergate, and even still from some of the disappointments of the Carter presidency. The public was very skeptical about the new president, and kind of would he be able to kind of live up to his promises, or would they be let down again? And I think that this assassination attempt, helped subside a lot of those feelings for a number of reasons. For one, you have to remember that a lot of the people who are alive at this point, and even still today, it wasn't that long ago,
right?
But people remember the Kennedy assassination, and there was a lot of fear. People didn't want that to happen again. They remembered how much that hurt. They remembered the way that shook up the country. And even there's some people that would kind of blame it for leading into things like Vietnam. And looking at that, a lot of people were reminded of Kennedy and what had happened there, and they were kind of looking at this new president, and they basically. His approval rating went up after that. People kind of unified around him in that moment by kind of saying, like, this is the guy who was elected. This is who we want to be president. And, we're going to kind of stand by him as he recovers and all that. So in a lot of ways, I've heard some historians say that it saved his presidency. I think that's a bit dramatic, considering, again, he was only 2 months in. But I think that it definitely, assassination attempts are always bad, but it definitely gave him a boost that helped him going in to that first term, to be able to kind of have people have kind of hope and some trust in him to be able to actually fix these issues.
Yeah, definitely. And again, it was not just that he pulled through. I think it was the way that he came out of it, sort of tapping in. Again, Reagan's one-liners are, pretty legendary. But I think it was the way he came out of it was sort of, again, this very optimistically tough guy, sort of persona that he had. And again, he was thankfully discharged from I think it was George Washington University Hospital on April 11th. So not even 2 weeks after he was shot. And also, what last thing I'll mention about this, what this did or ended up doing was it broke what was called the curse of Tippecanoe. I'm sure you're aware of this, Isaac, that dating back to 1840, every president until Ronald Reagan that had been elected in a year that ended in a zero had died in office, because you
Yep.
had William Henry Harrison. Of course, he only served a month in office. He died in, a month in. Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. He was assassinated. Garfield was elected in 1880. He was assassinated. McKinley was assassinated. He was reelected in 1900. You had Harding, who was elected in 1920. He died in office. FDR, who was elected to his third term in 1940, he died in office. And of course, Kennedy was the last of these in 1960, and he was assassinated. So, a lot of folks thought like, hey, this is actually going to continue with Reagan. What the heck is going on here? And to this point,
Reagan, George W. Bush, and Joe Biden are brave men.
Yeah, yes, they are. Yes, they are. No, they thankfully that curse has apparently been broken. But we move out of this, and also, right after or months after the attempt on President Reagan's life, he lived up to a campaign promise, and he filled the vacant Supreme Court seat with a woman, Sandra Day O'Connor, who again was the first woman to ever serve in our nation's highest court. And so just talk about again the obviously Sandra Day O'Connor, but also again how Reagan comes out of this almost stronger than he was before.
Yeah, his approval rating was around, above 70% after the assassination attempt, which is, very high for a president's approval rating. And, he goes in, he recovers afterwards, and is kind of trying to get back into normal work and all that. And I'm glad you brought up the appointment of Justice O'Connor. Reagan, I think sometimes in more recent years has been kind of viewed unfavorably when it comes to his stance on kind of promoting kind of like social justice issues. And
Right.
there are like complaints that can be made there that are legitimate. But I think it's unfair to characterize him as somebody who didn't care about these issues and didn't do anything about these issues. I think this is a good example of that. It was very important for him to kind of help continue to help raise the status of women in the U.S. He also wanted to appoint somebody to the court that he thought, was well qualified and would be, respected. And he knew going into that position, whichever woman he nominated was going to face quite a bit of sexism. I've actually read quite a bit about his choice in picking O'Connor. Funny enough, part of it was because he wanted to pick somebody from the West. He was a little biased there.
Right.
But
Being from California.
Yes. But he, and multiple times in meetings, is kind of quoted as talking about how impressed he was with the way that O'Connor handled herself and the way that, she was able to kind of, when he kind of made his jokes and everything, that she kind of gave it right back at him. And then also the fact that she was someone who was, extremely intelligent and was just, doing a phenomenal job as a judge already. Her appointment is the one, like all Supreme Court justices, there are some decisions she's made that had been controversial, but her tenure as a justice, I think is remembered. She was a swing vote. She was someone that took the law very seriously, and after leaving the bench until her retirement from public life, she was an advocate for increasing civics education in the U.S. and making sure that kind of people were growing up knowing how the government was supposed to function. And I think that I know I'm going a little rant about Sandra Day O'Connor here, but I am a fan.
Sure.
It is. I think that she is a good example of the way that Reagan had to take that a lot of Republican presidents had on the trying to promote kind of civil and equal rights, or I guess civil and equal standing at this point, was a little more subtle, but it was by kind of helping to elevate people who were qualified for these positions and to kind of make them well known among the public so that kind of, even though they're the first, they won't be the last, and making sure that it was someone that people would respect and feel confident in, so that when it came time and the next woman was appointed to the court, the public would feel comfortable. Um, and I think that he deserves credit there, along with, O'Connor herself, obviously. Uh, but I think that it's something that, O'Connor's legacy in recent years, I feel like has, to some extent, been forgotten a little bit. But I think that, she's someone that should definitely be celebrated by the public, for her work. And I think, Reagan should be, remembered for helping to kind of promote that equality and breaking barriers on the court.
No, 100%. I think you make a lot of good points there in terms of her appointment, and obviously not just the historic nature of it, but the fact that he was so open to the idea of, a woman finally being, again, on the bench in the highest court in the land. And so there were a lot of instances, this being a good example, where Reagan, it looks like, every single decision was intentional and very calculated. And again, we'll see certainly decisions down the road in this presidency that would prove this. And then there were other times where it didn't look like that was the case. Maybe that he was either in the dark about it, or maybe not as up to date as you would maybe want him to be. I think we're sort of skipping ahead a bit, but I think a good example of this would be the Iran-Contra affair.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have, and I think it's without a question, in terms of his presidency, the biggest stain on it. He denied knowledge of the illegal scheme that funded anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua with proceeds from covert arms sales to Iran. And again, with most presidents, I think the claim would be, or would seem, far-fetched. But I think with Reagan, there was sort of we could maybe see how this could possibly be true. But when it was all said and done, he avoided criminal charges. But in his own, I guess, subtle Reagan way, he kind of took the blame a bit.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not. As the Tower Board reported, what began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated in its implementation into trading arms for hostages. This runs counter to my own beliefs, to administration policy, and to the original strategy we had in mind.
So talk about the Iran-Contra affair and how kind of the country reacted to it.
I think the biggest...
I think hey, Isaac, you cut out just for a second there. Could you go back to what you were saying?
I think the biggest note that I have on the Iran-Contra affair is just that people lost, faith in Reagan. Not totally, but they felt betrayed. They had kind of regained. I keep going back to Watergate here, but the public lost a lot of trust in the president during Watergate. And successive presidents, even though we talked about the ups and downs of the Ford and Carter presidencies, helped kind of regain that trust. And while there were difficult times and there were ways that people lost respect for them, I don't think people, they didn't feel like Jimmy Carter was totally kind of a liar that was just out betraying them, and never totally with.
I think
I'm so sorry about that. The Wi-Fi's been a little spotty.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
But but this is probably the closest I think we get to kind of a loss of trust in the presidency. And we see Reagan's approval rating drops by some 20 points. And I think that it just plays into that people felt like Reagan, being so open and honest with the public and kind of his media addresses and things, was telling them the whole story. And for him to kind of, for this to come out, and then for him to, at first kind of claim no knowledge of it, which even now is debated, it just made people kind of look at him and be like, well, is this narrative that you kind of been pursuing about your presidency, is it true or not? And he was able to recover from this crisis, I feel like, but his approval rating was never up in the 70s again while he was in office. So I think that I think it highlights the importance of if you're going to be honest in the office of president, you have to be, to some extent, totally honest. Or, I think you have to be a little bit more, and this has become more of the norm in recent years after this, to kind of say, I'm going to be honest with you with what I can tell you, with what is, what the public can know. And, that way, if something comes out, hopefully something that's not super sketchy, but if something comes out that the people didn't know, that they're not really sure about, there's at least that kind of barrier of, I didn't tell you I was telling you everything. I told you I was telling you what you needed to know.
Right. Right. I think you hit the nail on the head with that. And certainly with Reagan, again, it was a loss, as you mentioned, excuse me, a loss of some trust. But I think also it was sort of a surprise to a lot of Americans in that, like, hey, you sort of not continued the Jimmy Carter route of quote unquote never telling the public a lie,
Mm-hmm.
but in your own, again, I go back to sort of the Reagan way, communicating the message well. And in this, I think this was probably the lowest point of his of his run, if you will, as the great communicator. But again, despite the Iran Contra affair, I think he sort of stayed true to his beliefs. His bottom line goals in office was to downsize the government, spend big on the military, and to lower taxes. And this became known as Reaganomics. And it led to a booming economy in the 80s, but it would see record deficits in the 90s with some of the way that it went down. And in 1983, he unveiled what was one of the more interesting strategies to combat Soviet missiles. They called it the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which was mostly a product of Reagan's own imagination. It was, some even called it the Star Wars Initiative, and it was something that the Soviets actually genuinely took seriously, which we'll discuss a little later. But just talk about SDI and how it was sort of like, for a lot of Reagan's advisors too, they were like, this is an interesting way to combat this issue.
Yeah, he was just very adamant that he wanted the program to continue. And, interesting enough, it's actually something that has kind of come back up in recent politics again, about developing some kind of, space missile capabilities. But, he was very adamant about it. It was something that, especially with the technology they had at the time, was just not possible. There's even some debate about if it's possible now. And but he was seemingly, like, for no reason, super adamant that we needed to have this program and keep this program. And in a roundabout way, it kind of worked for him because it was a good bargaining chip for a lot of his meetings, but he refused to give up on it. He refused to get rid of it. And, it hurt to the point, one of his meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev, ended. Part of the reason why it ended was because Reagan was so insistent that he would not budge on this program. So I think it just shows, if anything, like it is, I would say that it was kind of an irrational move, but I don't think that it means that Reagan was irrational. I think that it's just kind of highlighting, like, kind of the human side, that there's always going to be, like, at least, and maybe I'm speaking more to my own character here, there's always going to be, like, those weird things that people just are really stubborn about for no reason. And I feel like, if anything, I feel like this highlights that. And, I think when it comes to President of the United States, you would kind of hope that they might be able to see through that a little bit. But I think the Star Wars program shows a little bit of kind of Reagan's humanity in that sense.
Yeah, and I can promise you, Isaac, you're not just speaking for yourself. We all have things that we are extremely stubborn about. I'm certainly guilty of that. But I think it sort of goes to part of what made Reagan very popular is sort of, he was a very idealistic type of president. And I think this really played into that. But again, the SDI happens, and look, Americans clearly liked what Reagan was doing because they reelected him overwhelmingly again in 1984. And his campaign message sort of touted that it was morning in America, and it was, good to celebrate the good things that were going on in the country. And the only downside to this was, not celebrating the good things in America. Of course, we should always do that. But it sort of at times it would ignore things such as the AIDS epidemic that would go on in the 1980s, which would be a very, a lot of people had debated how Reagan handled that particular epidemic. And, again, it was sort of again, I wouldn't say idealistic being a completely bad thing, but it did certainly have its downsides, such as this example. But I would argue that the second half, or the second term rather, of his presidency can really be defined in two events. And what really, I think, above all, shapes his legacy. And one of them, the first at least, involves a national tragedy. Because on January the 28th of 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded barely a minute into flight. The tragedy shocked the nation, and everyone mourned the losses of these 7 brave men and women who were willing to go into space. And that night, Reagan was actually scheduled to deliver his State of the Union address, but he postponing it, deciding to speak to the country that evening from the Oval Office.
The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
This speech by Reagan, and it was only a 4-minute address from the Oval Office, but I think what it shows is, I think, something that I've talked to people about this, that I think every president needs to have, is a sort of I guess in Reagan's case, a sort of grandfatherly complex, where something terrible has just happened to these 7 astronauts. The country is just stunned, especially for one of the astronauts who was a school teacher, which really, kind of hit close to home for a lot of people. And it was sort of a thing for America where, they look to the president like, hey, how are you going to sort of help our morale? And I think this is something that every great president has had. So talk about Reagan's the way he handled the Challenger disaster, and how the public really rallied around him after this.
I think that, this is a great example of how great of an orator he was. I think you can really see, his personal feelings definitely come through, I think, in his address, and his own just personal reaction to kind of the shock of the tragedy. But I think, we also hear just the way that, he is really kind of addressing the country, and the way that they are feeling, and the way that they are reacting to this. And there's a bit of a resolve there, in the tone of his voice. And I don't want to point all of it back to him being an actor, but, he is someone that had a lot of control over his tone. He had a lot of control over his mannerisms when he was giving addresses. And he was able to, if there was a particular message or feeling he wanted to convey, he was able to do it, I think, better than any other president that we have had in kind of the television era. And I think that in his response to Challenger, we just are able to see him, I think you're able to see what kind of appeals about Reagan in the way that he has such a caring tone, and that he's able to kind of address these needs and show some resolve without seeming like he is too distant from the problem itself, if that makes sense.
Right.
Without seeming out of touch. And I just think that, no, you can go ahead.
No, go ahead. I want you to finish.
And I just think that, that's something that presidents have always kind of struggled to find the balance with. And I feel like, not always, I think it's changed what we compare it to, but for a while after that, I would say probably until 9/11, the comparison to kind of tragedies and the way presidents respond to it, and even now some today, was to Reagan's response to the Challenger disaster.
Definitely. And I think that's, really what part of the Reagan appeal, and part of the, what to me makes a great president is when something awful happens, how are you going to respond to it? And how does the country react to what you're saying? How are you conveying your message? Once again, and this is again part of what made Reagan the great communicator. He could have the one-liners. He could, joke around with Walter Mondale in the 1984 presidential debates, and then he could be able to tap into a more somber tone when something awful like this happens. And again, it's one of his great, if not his greatest strength, without a question.
And he could reach all of those tones well. He did all of them well.
Absolutely. Absolutely, he did. And again, the second of these events in his second term, probably the biggest event of his second term, was the attempt to finally end the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Again, despite his strong rhetoric, which at times he would use as political cover, Reagan took a much softer approach to the Soviet General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev. And, the two became, fast friends as time wore on, and Reagan somewhat disarmed, who is a very what's the word I'm looking for? Not just smart, but kind of slick guy in Gorbachev. And Reagan would kind of disarm him with his wit and with his charisma. And the SDI, which you talked about, would become a more of a key figure later on. This was something that they took seriously because they had been dealing with internal economic problems, and Gorbachev knew he couldn't keep up with the United States in an arms race in space. And so on a trip to the divided city of Berlin in 1987, Reagan made it pretty darn clear what he wanted General Secretary Gorbachev to do.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
When people think about Ronald Reagan, this is really, I would say, the first or one of the first speeches or quotes that come to mind. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And what I find ironic about it, and it's somewhat, I think it's somewhat similar to what we talked about with Abraham Lincoln with the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln didn't think, actually, as you mentioned, Lincoln didn't think it was that great of a speech. People didn't really think that this would be a big statement in terms of it coming to fruition so quickly. Now, by the time the Berlin Wall fell, Reagan had already left office. He had retired to California. But talk about I think, again, it was the tone that he set in the speech, calling for, for Mr. Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall.
I think that speech is a good example. I actually think it marks a good example in kind of a change in tone in his speeches. And his speech about the Soviet Union, before he was using a very, very antagonistic tone, which sometimes he would even use, in between meetings with Gorbachev. But he did soften his tone publicly as he started to kind of realize that there was, a door here to actually ending the Cold War. I think the end of the Cold War is a very complex situation. And I think that, Reagan is in a little bit of a mix where I feel like people either give him way too much credit or way too little credit.
Yes.
People are either like, he ended it single-handedly by himself, or they're like, no, he did nothing, which neither of those are true. It's kind of a mix of right place, right person, right time. He was, president of the United States. Obviously, he had to play a role in ending that conflict. But also Gorbachev is somebody that comes up that does have, at first, the public isn't sure, but he does have some different ideas of how the Soviet Union should be run. He also is somebody that believes that it's time for there to be some serious reforms, including economic reforms, which is a really big deal. So you have that, and a sense from Gorbachev that there needs to be more cooperation with the United States, and that if we're going to finish and take care of these domestic problems, then they can't have, huge foreign policy issues. You can't get those things done. So you have a mix where, he is willing to where Gorbachev is willing to kind of come and sit down at the table, and Reagan picks up on that and is able to kind of, bring them to that table and be able to have those conversations. And, the collapse of the Soviet Union happens really because, when those changes in domestic policy are made, the way that I would describe it was a little bit of like, okay, why go halfway? Was kind of the reaction from the people there. But I think the end of the Cold War, which I think happens before that, is when you're able to get both of those world leaders sitting at a table together. And the goal, I think, from coming into those meetings for both of them was to end the Cold War. I think the first meeting they weren't sure. I think by the time of the second and third meeting, even though it was difficult, even though, the whole thing was very rocky about whether this would make an impact in the long run, I think when you had those two world leaders who wanted to end the Cold War, who were ready to end the Cold War, who knew that it was not beneficial to either of their nations at this point to continue this ongoing conflict, and as the USSR was ready to, at least temporarily stop trying to kind of push communism on the world stage to take care of its domestic issues, you had a moment where these two men both knew that it was time, and they were able to kind of end it without, a massive war, or without, at that time, the destruction of one of the two countries. They were able to just kind of let it settle. And I think that, there's a lot of nuances to the end of that conflict. And I think, Reagan definitely deserves credit for it. And I think Gorbachev definitely deserves credit to it. And I think it's one of those situations that it's really those kind of once in I don't know how long events that you're able to have a conflict that goes on for such a long period of time, such high tensions, such high stakes, and it end without bloodshed, without a direct armed conflict between these two nations, and that they're able to end it by just sitting down and talking with each other.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I think you hit on what I was going to mention perfectly, that, oftentimes, and listen, Reagan's not the only beneficiary and or victim of this, but I think Reagan's greatest supporters say, he does deserve the majority of the credit because he was president. And then you got people who say, well, the right place, right time. I think it's a mixture of the two. I think it's leading back or going back to Harry S. Truman all the way on to Ronald Reagan, where it is a sort of domino effect of presidents who helped end the Cold War and ultimately in the Soviet Union. And Reagan, to his credit, and he does deserve credit without a question, is able to capitalize on this. And so again, this happens. And, after leaving office, Ronald Reagan spent his remaining years in California, where he would stay active in politics up until he was unfortunately diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 1994. But before we talk about sort of the end of his life, what's sort of your takeaway on his presidency? And it has been, I guess, possibly because it was fairly recent. I mean, he was president 40 years ago. How his legacy has been debated by historians on and off about certainly the great things he did in office, and then things such as obviously the Iran-Contra affair and the AIDS epidemic. Like, talk about like how sort of his legacy has been debated, and why he is, I think, by the majority of Americans, considered a pretty darn good president.
So there's something that I think is interesting, is it's not all historians, but there are a lot of historians who really don't like Reagan. And I think that from kind of what I've heard and seen, it has less to do with like actual personal feelings about Reagan and the policies that he promoted, and more of the narrative that he was like the greatest president we've ever had. I think that he was the best communicator of any president that we've ever had. I think that is a fair title to give him.
Sure.
I think that there are definitely a lot of highs. I think that he had a lot of, was able to be someone that the public could put their faith in. He was able to be somebody that was able to move the country in a new direction without, severe domestic crises, which is something that, the last several presidents before him were not able to do. And I think that there was a lot of nuance and skill to a lot of the decisions that were made in his presidency. But again, I think presidents before him, not for their lack of trying, failed to do in several pretty public attempts. I think that at the same time, he has, and I'm not totally sure why, I'm genuinely not, has kind of been glorified as this like greatest president ever, which just isn't true.
Right.
He was someone who, did a lot of good, and I think has been a figurehead of his political party and will continue to be, probably rightfully so, a figurehead of his political party for decades and decades to come. But I think that when I look at his legacy, what I see is a presidency that changed America in a lot of ways. I think he really changed how people expected their presidents to act and interact with the public. I think the way that like television addresses work and that sort of thing now, every president since him has kind of echoed Reagan in that communication style, or at least tried to, with varying levels of success. And I think that, kind of in the same way that, they echoed from Franklin Roosevelt before with his fireside chats. But I think at the same time, I don't think there needs to be perspective that a lot of the major successes of the Reagan presidency are not just because of him. And I think that's where a lot of historians have issues with it is, the end of the Cold War is, a lot of that falls on Mikhail Gorbachev and the fact that Gorbachev was willing to sit down with him and that Gorbachev wanted to end the conflict. I think finding that balance there of, the kind of greatness of Reagan's presidency, but also the reality that everything is always more complex than it looks, is kind of the difficulty that we have with Reagan. And I think that's why, now today you can find such far extremes on him of people that hate him and think he's horrible and terrible, and people that think he was the greatest president ever. Because everything's always more complex than it seems. And I think that, history at large, all presidents at large, but I think Reagan is a good example of this, of, it is hard sometimes for the public to see that nuance of, he was a good president. I think it's hard to deny that.
Sure.
But he wasn't a perfect president. None of them were. So.
Oh, 100%. And I think, look, and it's funny you bring up, it's funny you bring up FDR. You
Mhm.
know, FDR was actually Reagan's sort of idol in a way for the office, despite the fact that their policies could not be more different.
Mhm.
But it was, I think Reagan saw maybe a lot of himself in FDR, and obviously talk about him as a great communicator with this fireside chats, and Reagan, possibly even being greater at that, and sort of being able to strike what they both did was they struck a sympathetic tone for the country, and like you said with his legacy, and it's obviously been debated certainly since he left office in 1989 by numerous historians, that it like you said, they don't really have an issue with Reagan. It's the narrative surrounding him that they have a problem with. And it's being able to, when we debate the legacies of every president, and look, hey, we're going to do that in episode 10.
Yeah.
But being able, as you mentioned, nuance,
Mhm.
and being able to say, okay, was the country in a better spot when this man left office than when he came in, and what role did he have in that? Like, I think
Yeah.
that matters too, and Reagan had a pretty big role in that. So,
Yes.
certainly he deserves a ton of credit there. But again, he leaves office. He's sadly diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 1984. And after his diagnosis, his wife, Nancy Reagan, would become an advocate of stem cell research, as she hoped it would lead to a cure to the disease. And then 10 years later, on June the 4th of 2004, Ronald Reagan passed away at the age of 93. And so, I think it was really at this moment when he passed that he was looked, and we see this with a lot of presidents. I think we're going to see with the next president we're going to talk about, he is sort of, I guess, given credit for the things he did do, and maybe put up on a higher level, than maybe when he left office. So just his overall legacy, like, not just the debate as to whether or not he was a great president, because I think most people, for the most part, agree he was, or at least a very good president. Just his overall legacy. What's kind of your takeaway on Ronald Reagan?
I think that his overall legacy is as someone who defined modern American conservatism. I think he's someone who gave the Republican Party kind of a clear agenda for the future. And I think that in a lot of ways they have tried to find leaders like him, at least in tone. They kind of inspire people the same way that he inspired members of the party. I think that he's also remembered as the great communicator. I think that his communication skills, like I already said, are have been echoed by every president since then. And I think that he also is remembered very, very nostalgically. And I think that kind of the goal to be the next president that can create that kind of nostalgic era has been something that every president since him has tried to create, maybe except for George H.W. Bush. And I think, in my personal opinion, none of them have been able to kind of recreate that era, despite their best attempts. Not that they've been bad presidents or anything like that. They have not been able to recreate the feeling that Reagan was able to create in the American public.
Oh, definitely. And I think, in terms of the American culture, which of course the president plays certainly in modern times a huge part in, I think Reagan really tapped into what is sort of a, the 80s is a very revered decade. So I think, Reagan was able to sort of tap into that and the public, responded pretty favorably. But now we move on to his successor, George H.W. Bush, who was, well, actually, before we even get into him, let's give him his proper introduction. Number 41, George H.W. Bush, Republican, 1989 to 1993, 64 years old, from Texas. The first sitting vice president to assume the office since Martin Van Buren all the way back in 1937, George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, rather, was born on June the 12th of 1924 to Prescott Bush and Dorothy Walker, and he married Barbara Pierce in 1945, and they had 6 children together. And again, he was very, as you mentioned sort of briefly there, he was very different from Reagan in many different ways. But his campaign platform famously was based off of his campaign promise was summed up in pretty simple terms.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
Of course, this is something that that the opposition would use to kind of that would come to bite him in the butt a little bit later on. But sort of I'll ask you, talk about the sort of persona of George H.W. Bush, because there was plenty, and I'll touch on a little bit, but there was plenty of false narratives that were going around about sort of who he was as a man and as a politician.
Yeah, I think that he was someone who was also actually pretty honest with the American public.
Sure.
I think he's interesting because public persona of him was so different, and this sounds bad, but I always think of the SNL impression of him because
Dana Carvey.
Yes, it's one of their best presidential impressions. Because he was viewed lots of times as someone, especially when he was president, as someone who was kind of out of touch, but meant really, really well. Like he was doing his best.
Yeah.
And I think that in a lot of ways that's an unfair characterization. I think he was probably at least the closest we've had to an introvert as president in the modern era. And I think he also, I use this, I know some people don't like this language, but I would describe him as a nerd. Like, that I think definitely he was a nerd, and I think that all that plays into what is like just personality wise and stuff. He's not the guy that normally becomes president. You watch speeches of him and stuff and all that, and he gave wonderful speeches and all that, but he's just personality wise, he is not as charismatic as Reagan. He's not as personable as Reagan. And I think in his sense, I don't think either of those necessarily hurt him. Because I think that he does well in different ways. But he, I don't know. I think he's just interesting because he is different than them in a way that I think is unique.
Definitely. And you mentioned the word nerd. That was, I wouldn't even say the word nerd. I think some, at least certainly the opposition, there was sort of a narrative going around that he was, I guess, because he wasn't necessarily the commanding, the big presence of Ronald Reagan and of presidents of the past, that some even described him very incorrectly as a sort of like a wimp figure, which Lord Jesus knows this could be more, further from the truth. I mean, he was shot down in World War II.
Yes. And then like
And
stranded on like a raft in the ocean
yeah,
for like 2 days or something like that.
and almost died, serving his country. And he was also, he was one of the most qualified men to become president. He had been a two-term
Mm-hmm.
congressman from Texas, a UN ambassador, the head of the CIA. As a matter of
Mm-hmm.
fact, it was he, when he was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, who formally asked Richard Nixon to resign in
Mm-hmm.
1974. So he was a very, again, an honest man, certainly a very qualified man to enter the office.
Mm-hmm.
He was like you said, he was a different president in that people with his sort of personality normally don't become president, at least certainly in the
Mm-hmm.
modern times. I guess certainly, I guess he made the big promise: "Read my lips, no new taxes." But I think it's, it's kind of they say about politicians to under promise, over deliver, right? Not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's safe to say that most of the modern presidents have tended to struggle with this. And then that's, again, he's a very different president. To your point about the Dana Carvey impression, he said it's like a mix between John Wayne and Johnny. I think it was Johnny Cash. I think it was,
Mm-hmm.
or Mr. Rogers. Like that's kind of
Yes.
how it was. But again, he was a very intelligent man. He was a Yale grad. He was also a very extremely competitive guy. But during the 1988 campaign, again, they talked about him being a wimp. Of course, that not being true at all. And he was actually awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. But once coming into office, he wanted to show that he was sort of a more engaged manager than his predecessor, Ronald Reagan. And at times, he would drive cabinet members crazy because he governed as sort of a centrist and kind of would just go with the consensus. Like, he wasn't somebody who would just cling to a position, which some would argue might be a deficiency, but I would almost argue is a very positive trait for a president, because if you are willing to move on certain issues, I think that's, and again, we'll see this later in his term. Again, I think that's a positive trait. But I think the two events that defined his presidency were both foreign issues. The first, of course, was the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, early in his term. And in this major event, he was sort of famously criticized for not making this, I guess, for lack of a better term, a big show of it. He was very, relaxed about it. And, I think he absolutely made the right move in this, for the simple fact that he realized that he is going to need Mikhail Gorbachev as an ally, moving forward. And it was key in making sure that the Cold War ended smoothly and not, chaotically. So talk
Mm-hmm.
about that and his reaction to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and how, again, I think sort of the perception of it was wrong-headed in my view.
Yeah, so at the time, as the Soviet Union is collapsing, the reaction from a lot of Americans at the time, I think very understandably, is kind of like, we did it, like they're gone now, and Bush didn't buy into that narrative and didn't respond that way. If anything, I think, and it wasn't total radio silence, but I think radio silence isn't a terrible way to put it. He didn't make it a big deal. He didn't try to kind of push our way in and make ourselves kind of the focal point of this moment. And instead, he let these peoples who are now finally, in not everywhere, but in a lot of these newly formed countries out of the former Soviet republics and out of the the what had been the satellite states in Eastern Europe, as they're finally kind of gaining self-determination and being able to kind of make these difficult decisions about what they wanted their future to be. He kind of let that focus be on them, and he quietly had the State Department be able to kind of help negotiate on their behalf and be able to provide some economic assistance. Quietly, he did it without a big show. Even now, after his passing, there was kind of a re-emphasis on this, and people kind of reevaluating his presidency. But I think definitely, I think it's incredibly admirable. I think he handled that in a way that I don't think, not in a bad way, but I don't think Reagan would have. And I think
Right.
that he handled it in a way that few presidents would have, but I think he did it the right way. I think by letting these people kind of have their moment and not make their decision of what they were going to do with their countries into kind of a greater statement for the world, he let it just be something to them. So they weren't having to sit there when they were kind of, while constitutions were being written and drawn, he wasn't sitting there saying, and this is, the next step forward for the world, and this is what America wants you to do. But he was letting them figure it out for themselves, while still quietly being there to kind of give assistance when necessary. Um, and like another important thing that I'll note, like there were kind of debates and topics about whether should NATO still exist after this? Should, once Germany was reunited, should a united Germany be accepted into NATO? And what he argued, again, quietly without a bunch of public fanfare, was, one, that we should keep NATO, that it was good for the world to be able to have that kind of organization help keep a military alliance and keep the Allied powers together in Europe. But also, he argued that a united Germany should be allowed in and that they should still be considered a founding member. And by doing that, he, helped keep Germany's kind of status in Europe elevated. And also, as they're going through, East Germany was not in a good state domestically. He was able to kind of give them a continued needed boost to be able to help recover that area of the now, reunited Germany. There's a lot of nuances in his post-Soviet Union policy and the way that he handled the breakup of the Soviet Union. But, the more that one looks into it, I think the more impressive it is that he was able to do so much without making it some giant public event.
I think, and the statement I'm about to make may sound sacrilegious to some, it's a little Lincoln-esque. Because when after the Civil War, or as it's coming to an end, Lincoln has famously said, with malice toward none and charity for all. I think it's a philosophy that I think Harry Truman followed after World War II, and I think it's something that that George Bush follows, following the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And again, I think it's something that could assist presidents certainly in the future moving forward, that I think he understood at the time was the right move to make. Now, the second major event of his presidency began in 1990 when Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait. And other than defending Kuwait, Bush had other reasons for going to war, including protecting the energy reserves of the Persian Gulf. And in the months leading up to the war, Bush would enlist the support of the United Nations, and he would build an international coalition of 34 countries to remove Saddam from Kuwait. And after 5 weeks of aerial bombardment, the ground war began, and within hours, the Iraqi army was in full retreat from Kuwait. And Bush, at this point, now had an opportunity to possibly go after Saddam Hussein. And, he had an opportunity to send troops into Baghdad to topple his regime, essentially. But he decided against it somewhat controversially because he said that America had accomplished its goal, which was simply to remove the Iraqi army from Kuwait. And it was a decision that he was confident in. So talk about sort of his move here in, again, I think saying sort of true to his guns, like, hey, we've got an agenda, we've got a mission that we're going to go through with, nothing more, nothing less. Like, just talk about sort of how he handled, the war in Kuwait.
I think there are several really important aspects to the first Gulf War. I think the first one is that it was not very long. It was successful and it was not very long. But you think about the armed conflicts that the U.S. had been in before this, the two most notable ones would have been the Vietnam War and the Korean War. And Vietnam was definitely still in the minds of the American people when it came to their military. A really drawn out conflict, one that people didn't really understand why we were involved in, and one that people viewed as kind of oppressive and just a mistake, and it made the military look bad, it made the U.S. look bad. And now you have this one where the U.S. is coming. A lot of the popular narrative is that we are defending the people of Kuwait. We are able to see the military in action because the way the television had advanced up to that point, and it's a really successful battle. It's not, at least on our side. There are obviously deaths and all that, but it's not prolonged. There's not a ton of bloodshed. And, it really restored faith in the military that had been lagging since the Vietnam War, and was able to kind of make people feel more confident in kind of the status of the military. That's one aspect. I think another aspect, I think that it's really interesting that he faced at the time a lot of criticism for not going into Iraq and overthrowing Saddam Hussein's dictatorship there, which is something that the U.S. would go on to do later on, about a decade later. I think that that's very interesting as well. I think that he showed a lot of restraint there. I think he also was looking at it. He was someone, like we had said, had served in World War II, was alive and in government for different parts of the Vietnam War, had seen these different conflicts. I think he knew that it just wasn't worth the risk. I think that he definitely saw Sudan as a threat. I think, for Hussein, he also, sometimes afterwards said that he kind of wished that maybe he had done more or tried to push for some sort of regime change. But I think at the time he definitely made the right decision, that it was kind of a victory, literally and I think symbolically for the U.S. And I think that if he had pushed that, I think that could have risked turning into something that it didn't need to be.
Yeah, and I think that's something that he understood was going to be a controversial decision either way, because you would certainly have people who would agree with him in not going after Saddam, and if he did, it'd be like, well, you're sort of diverting from what the intended goal was to do, and that's something that Bush was. He was a very intentional man, and I think that's something that was something that defined him as president, and it's something that soared his approval rating all the way up to 84%, which with numbers like that, re-election seems like a foregone conclusion. But what would follow is record deficits, which would be, which were caused by, a lot of Reagan's economic policies, which would give Bush it would put him in a really tough position. He didn't really have a choice. He had to go against his 1988 campaign promise and raise taxes. Well, of course, the Democrats are going to capitalize on this, say, hey, Bush lied to the people. But I think it's something, and of course, he would go on to lose the 1992 election. But I think at the end of the day, he realized, okay, what's good for the country? Are they better off with me keeping a campaign promise and these deficits continue to hurt Americans? Or really, at the end of the day, what is more important? Is it my words or is it the actions that I take? Because down the road, these actions that I take, given the deficits, given the economic issues of the time, it'll be able to set up who would eventually become my successor. Just clung to this campaign promise. And again, that is something that George Bush, he was very different from a lot of presidents in that he had goals, he had an agenda, but he wasn't clinging to them like it was, like his baby or something. Right. So I think that's something that personally is fairly commendable. But again, it set up the country for the economic boom in the 90s. But talk about, again, his legacy, especially, since he passed away recently, which we'll discuss. His legacy, I think, has been looked upon pretty favorably. Certainly, I think, for presidents that only served one term.
Yeah, I think that what's really happened with Bush's legacy, I think that it's been softened. The way that I've heard his failed re-election campaign described, that it really wasn't about not liking Bush. It was just that people were just kind of like, if that makes sense. He was fine. I think that, his legacy, looking back on it, I think he's viewed as much more successful than people had kind of given him credit for up to that point. And I think that that's fair. There was a lot of, serious successes in his presidency. I think that he's remembered for now, I think, as his failure to get reelection is a little bit of an anomaly, because on paper, there was a lot of stuff that was kind of going for him being able to serve a second term. I think that his legacy ultimately, though, is similar to what Carter's is now, which is that he was just remembered for being a good man who, serve his country well and worked in whatever position he was in to be able to try to serve the country as best as he could. Um, and I think that's the way that he wanted to be remembered. And I think that's the way that he's going to continue to be remembered.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think we've seen instances in history. I think some of it, in fairness to Bush, I think some of it is, I'll use 1952 as an example. I think some of it is when one particular party is occupying the White House for so long, maybe Americans just want, sort of maybe a change of scenery. Like that's, because you had, obviously FDR and Truman were in the White House a combined, 20 years. Well, maybe they just want a change of tone. That's why they went with the Republican Eisenhower. I think in some ways, I could be wrong on this, but I think in some ways, maybe that's in part why they decided to go with the governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, who we'll get into in just a second. But sort of a change of tone. Like you said, it was maybe part of it was Bush's personality in that, he was obviously a very, very different from Clinton in that it wasn't this big commanding presence. But sort of like you said, he's really the last introvert to be to be president. And I think that maybe he wasn't as effective as Reagan in selling his ideas. I think that played factor.
I would definitely agree with that. I think another thing too is, just to continue with that contrast a little bit, I think, Clinton was younger than, Bush or Reagan had been. He had a lot of energy. He was very, very charismatic, which I'm sure we'll talk about those things in just a minute. But I think in contrast to Bush, who very subtle, very quiet, very kind of like, I don't know, well-mannered sort of deal. I think in contrast between those two, I think Bill Clinton just looked a lot cooler, which I think hurt Bush as well.
Sure, absolutely. And again, he left office. He was a respected figure. It's not like he left in disgrace. Like previous presidents had, especially one-term presidents had. But he was a very respected guy. He would go on to live a good retirement. And, up until Jimmy Carter surpassed him a few years ago, he had broken his predecessor, Ronald Reagan's record for the longest lived president. And as of course, he would witness his son become president 8 years after he left office. And he would pass away on November the 30th of 2018 at the age of 94. So like we've talked about, excuse me, his legacy has been, I think, looked upon more favorably not just since he left office, but since he passed away a few years back. As a guy who, I think, again, his biggest deficiency was the fact that maybe he wasn't as good as Reagan or even Clinton, certainly, as at not bragging about his ideas, but showing the public, hey, this is what we're doing, while I'm in office. And that was sort of his one deficiency that I think the biggest thing that cost him in 1992.
I think kind of a lesson that can, and in my personal opinion, should be learned from Bush. There's two main things. One, I think, is that introverts make good presidents too. And just because someone is going to be out and is going to be talking a lot and giving a lot of speeches and being really, really engaged with the public, that doesn't necessarily mean that he knows what the public wants or that he's going to do what the public wants. Right. So I think that's one thing. I think, along with that, there's also the side that's, you need a president that, whether, even if they pledge not to raise taxes, if that's the right thing to do, then they're going to do the right thing to do at that time. And then I think the second part is, I think what he highlights, in my personal opinion, something that, we should look for in presidents and presidential candidates, is I think humility is important. I think a president that isn't going to make everything about themselves and what they did about these different issues. And that's not necessarily a critique of any president. I think he just highlights that, you can be president and be humble and not make everything about yourself, which can be a hard thing to do when you're leading, the United States. So I think that those are kind of the two biggest takeaways I have from Bush, are kind of honesty and humility, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense. And it's something that are, I think, very important to a president is just be honest with the American people. And regardless of how successful or not your policies are, and some were with Bush, some were not, they're going to at least respect you. And if they respect you, then that's certainly a huge plus. But we now move on. Last president we're going to talk about in this episode 8, a man who, listen, man, I think God put this man on earth and said, this is a politician. This is a politician right here. We're talking about, of course, Bill Clinton. Number 42, Bill Clinton, Democrat, 1993 to 2001, 46 years old, from Arkansas. Bill Clinton, he was born on August the 19th of 1946 to William Jefferson Blythe and Virginia Cassidy, and he would marry Hillary Rodham in 1975, and they had one child together. And he was, in a lot of ways, similar, I think, to John F. Kennedy, sort of I'd even say even more so, sort of almost like a rock star kind of candidate, right? Like he played the saxophone. I believe on MTV he talked about his favorite underwear. He dodged allegations of extramarital affairs, which of course will become very important later on. But I think his sort of persona was one of a cool dude who sort of a rock star wannabe who ended up in the White House. So just talk about how the public kind of reacted to this new type of president. Very different from certainly, I'd even say the last, we'd really never seen a candidate like him.
He was the next generation. He was young. He was going out. He like you said, he was saying things that people wouldn't normally say, that wasn't expected or even by some extent acceptable for what a president should say. But he was funny. He was relatable. He played the saxophone. He was cool. He was kind of the epitome of like this cool guy politician. And I think he was also very good at speaking, but I think in a different way than we had seen with like Reagan and stuff. I think he was a lot more slick. And I think that he was just very in tune with kind of the culture of the time and what kind of like personality was popular at the time. I think that he was a good like example of that. And I think that's part of the reason why he was able to excel to the office.
Definitely. And his election sort of fulfilled a lifetime. He grew up as kind of a poor kid who grew up on the wrong side of the tracks. He met there's actually a video as a youngster. He met John F. Kennedy, and that sort of inspired him to, I guess, make something better of his life than he had grown up in. Again, if you had to pick one person in the last 50 years who truly embodied what a politician was, it was William Jefferson Clinton. That's just how it is. He was the embodiment of what a politician was. And his management style was somewhat chaotic, very different from his predecessor Bush. With most people in his cabinet meetings, being kind of casually dressed, they were very crowded meetings. And he was someone who wanted to hear the perspective of every single person, which again would sort of drive people a little nuts. But he wanted to see if he could hear a new perspective that could help him accomplish the goals that he had in office. So again, his management style is a little bit like, in my opinion, I think it's a little bit like FDR in a way, a little chaotic, a little off the rails a bit. But talk about his management style and how it was a little wild at times.
Yeah, he I think had a really weird balance between how involved he was going to be in like the different kind of cabinet members' work. In some cases, he would be like heavily involved and really kind of like looking into what they were doing and maybe micromanaging. But then at other times, he would be kind of like just kind of do whatever you're supposed to do, and it could be inconsistent. So there could be times where he would be very involved, not just like in his work, but in other people's work, and then other times he would kind of switch to kind of a delegation style, and it was inconsistent. But at the same time, it worked well for him. Like he did a good job of this weird balance that didn't really make sense between those different kind of management styles, in a way that normally would have been really disastrous for a presidency. I don't really know how, but he did make it work.
No, he did. He did. And that was, something that he was, again, going back to how he was, I guess, as a candidate, very cool, calm, collected. What wasn't a guy, maybe not in the same instance as say like maybe like a William McKinley, but somebody who was fairly measured. Wasn't going to, I guess, let his emotions get the best of him in terms of cabinet meetings and things of that nature, his leadership style. But among those who he adamantly listened to and took their advice was his own wife, the First Lady, Hillary Clinton. She was the first Lady to have her own office in the West Wing. And it was sort of a thing like his advisors, if they brought an idea to him and he said no, maybe they could bring it to the First Lady, and if she said yes, maybe she could convince him to go along with what they wanted. Certainly, she was one of the more, of course, as we all know now, but she was one of the more involved First Ladies in terms of policy that we've had. But the first 2 years of the Clinton presidency saw the failing of the administration's healthcare reform initiative, as well as the North American Free Trade Agreement, better known as NAFTA, of course. What also consumed the first 2 years was the scandals Clinton was involved with. Chief among them was the filing of a sexual harassment lawsuit by Paula Jones. And now the midterms come around in 1994, and the Republican Party gained control of both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years. And so Clinton... Most presidents would have viewed this, I think, as sort of a, well, crud, I'm done now. Like, I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do at this point. But I think he sort of decided to reverse course in a way, going a little bit more to the moderate side so that he could be able to compromise with the new Republican majority in both houses of Congress. So just talk about the first like couple of years of his presidency and how his tone really shifts after the 1994 midterms.
Yeah, there have definitely been critiques of this shift. Some people think that he should have stood and made like a really hard ideological stance, but I just don't think that was ever Bill Clinton. He could be really ideological, but I just feel like he always kind of leaned towards moderation. But he after the losses in the midterms and the Republican majority, he basically looked at it and was like, okay, we can either get things done or get nothing done, and he chose to get something done.
Right.
And a lot of their cooperation came on economic issues, and his handling of the economy is one of the things that is often cited as one of the best aspects of his presidency, is that he was able to handle the economy in a way that kind of made everybody on both sides of the aisle happy. He was able to reduce taxes, reduce spending, but he also and kept the economy in good shape, but also was able to keep things a little more fiscally conservative, which is popular among the Republican majority in Congress.
And I think this shift is something that I think he deserves a lot of credit for, because if you look at, say, I'll throw out a name like a Woodrow Wilson, for example, when the Republicans gain control, he is completely unwilling to compromise, and nothing gets done the last 2-3 years of his term. Bill Clinton sort of avoids this same mistake by doing this. But in that time period, he would encounter a man who would become, without a doubt, his number one nemesis, and that would be the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich. And it wasn't till budget negotiations of 1995 that really the battle between Clinton and Gingrich came to a head. With the threat of a government shutdown looming, Gingrich tried to force Clinton to make concessions on things such as Medicare spending, but the president refused to compromise. And this was, I think it was brilliant on the part of Clinton for political purposes, because now he could say, hey, the Republicans are trying to shut you guys out of this. And he sort of used that sort of narrative to his advantage. And, what ends up happening through this is he forced them to an eventual budget compromise. Now, however, during this shutdown, an unpaid White House intern would gain pretty close access to the president, which we will discuss later on. But due to the booming economy, above all else, he won re-election in 1996. But just talk about his certainly at this point in time, his popularity in being able to help the country, avoid a government shutdown. And as a matter of fact, once he took office pretty early in his second term, balancing the budget.
Yeah, that bipartisan stance that he had kind of taken and kind of get things done, again, especially economic issues, really served him well, because the economy is something that people tend to always be nervous about. It's the one issue that all Americans hold in common.
Yeah.
And by being able to play that card, being able to highlight those successes, he had an easy re-election. To Bob Dole's loss, but it really, I think, again, he was able to keep the coolness and the popularity there, but he was also able to be more serious and be able to be viewed seriously, which is a hard balance to find, and he did it really well. And he was able to, again, highlight, economic issues and success economically, which is one of the best issues for a president running for re-election. If the economy is strong, it's much more likely a president is going to be re-elected.
Definitely, it's a massive asset for a president, running for re-election, as you mentioned. And again, I think the economy was, without a question, his greatest legacy as president. It was certainly the high point of it. Unfortunately for President Clinton, the stressful days were about to come to an end, because in 1997 and carrying into 1998, Clinton's Oval Office affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky became public when the latter testified at the Paula Jones sexual harassment case. And of course, in January of 1998, Clinton famously denied these accusations.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
And this was obviously, so we talk about the "read my lips, no new taxes" being used against Bush. It's hard to find a statement that's used against the president more than this one right there. But talk about the country's sort of reaction to this, because there were some, Clinton supporters that were saying, well, it's none of our business what he does in his private life. And then there's other, on the other side of things, those who maybe weren't big Clinton fans, like, hey, come on, we can't have the president having, these sort of relations with, a White House intern, certainly much younger than him. And just talk about the reaction to the entire scandal.
Yeah. So we're at a point where what a sex scandal is, to the country is changing a little bit. Before this point, if a sex scandal came out, a president's career, any politician's career was basically over with. And part of it was because it was such a high stakes position that it led to people to kind of reevaluate that standard. And you had just a couple different main looks at it, which is kind of what you said. There were some that were kind of like, it's no big deal, as long as it doesn't affect his job as president, I don't really care. And then there was also another side to it, which I think in the long run has been the one that has been more consistent, which is that, it's inappropriate for a president, or for anyone to have an affair with a subordinate, and that there are like abuse of power issues there, and that power difference causes problems in whether that affair is totally consensual or not.
Definitely. And of course, as the investigation would continue, the president did not have a choice but to confess, which he did on August 17th.
Indeed, I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong. It constituted a critical lapse in judgment and a personal failure on my part, for which I am solely and completely responsible.
And of course, later that year, on December the 19th of 1998, Bill Clinton became the second president in U.S. history to be impeached on charges of perjury to a grand jury and obstruction of justice. But just like Andrew Johnson, two things similar to Andrew Johnson. First of all, as one would imagine, certainly in recent years as impeachment would, it was kind of a circus. It was the number one thing that everybody was talking about. But again, similar to Andrew Johnson, he was able to avoid removal from office. Wasn't as close as Johnson. Johnson avoided it by one vote. Clinton, not the same case. Basically, the U.S. Senate concluded that the president lying about his sex life was not a good enough reason to remove him from office, something that has obviously been debated on both sides of the aisle since then. But kind of talk about after the impeachment, Clinton avoids removal from office and how he sort of goes by, I guess, again, similar to Johnson, the rest of his term fairly quietly.
Yeah, after that point, it's a little bit of like, his public reputation was not going to recover at that point in his presidency. It was just going to take time. And even then, like now, it's still very contested when he goes to speak places. There's a lot of controversy about, how he should be viewed. And I don't really feel like you and I need to necessarily comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, no.
But I think, for the rest of his presidency, there was a lot of kind of waiting it out sort of feeling and trying to kind of recover that sense of excitement and optimism that the public had before. And in some cases he did. His approval rating recovered pretty well. It was just, there was just a lack of trust with him that had been lost with the public. And that played into things like when, his vice president was running for election in 2000,
Right.
Al Gore did not want him to campaign for him, and he didn't. And there is a lot of contention today about, how that affected Gore's campaign.
Definitely, and it was something that you brought up Al Gore, and that's obviously we'll talk about that at length in the next episode. But it was something that a lot of Democrats, especially those close to Clinton, kind of wanted to keep him at arm's length a little bit after this because it was such a touchy issue with the impeachment, with the Lewinsky scandal. But the rest of his term, he survived. Excuse me. He survives his impeachment, and he kind of did what he could to salvage the rest of his presidency, including an unsuccessful effort to revive the faltering peace process between Israel and Palestine. And by the time his presidency was over, Clinton had presided over, the longest economic expansion in American history. And so his legacy at the end of the day will be these two issues. It will be the booming economy, and it will be the impeachment, and it will be the Lewinsky scandal. So talk about how kind of, and it is still fairly soon to really get the full picture of his legacy because, he was president just 2 decades ago. How he will be remembered and how his legacy will sort of stack up.
I think that the way that he was able to work, with a Republican Congress, at least for a while, and be able to actually get some work done is something that even now I've seen cited as, like it is possible. Like if they choose to work together, and both sides have to choose to, they can get stuff done that everybody agrees on. So I think that is something that will be remembered. I think that now, I hate to say it, but I think his charisma is kind of wrapped up in the view of him, at least, and it is a contentious view of him being predatory towards women.
Right.
And I think that, that legacy is something that he, I will say it, I think it's his own fault, but I think it will define his presidency and his public opinion on him for the rest of his life. And I think for the rest of, American history, I think he'll be remembered as somebody who came in and brought a lot of energy to the office, and then, but wasn't totally honest and had a lot of issues that resulted in a loss of trust.
Yeah, definitely. And that's really where it ends. Now, of course, he since leaving office, he has stayed active in politics, particularly with his wife, Hillary, who will make, of course, a couple of appearances in the next episode of the series. And so we come to the end of this episode. We only covered 4 presidents today, but we certainly covered a lot of ground from the mid to late 1970s. Now we're in the 21st century. And so just talk about where we are at this point in American history, and where in the next episode we move into the present times.
Yeah, we're at the point where there is one clear world leader out of all the nations, and that is the United States. The USSR is gone. It's not contentious anymore. And now I would say the U.S. feels like it can kind of just focus on domestic issues, and that it doesn't really have to worry as much about foreign policy. That's going to be proven wrong. And I think we're going to see now really the effects of globalization and how interconnected the world is, and how, you know, most domestic issues have a foreign policy aspect to it. And I think you're going to see reactions against that, but I think you're also going to see presidents who are just going to accept it as, it's the way the world is. You can't undo that. The world is connected. So I think it'll be interesting because we're seeing presidents that have their actions have much more of a global response now. And then something else that will be notable is that we're about to have presidents. The first presidents. Clinton was, Bush was. Bush was the first president to have this is the Bush we talked about today, had the first computer in the White House. But we're going to see the internet age really come into effect, and the social media age really come into effect, and the way that changes the way that presidents are perceived and the way that they're expected to act. I think will be very interesting. I think that'll come up in our discussion.
100%. And I mean, heck, we know just today, like even outside of the realm of politics, how much social media has come into has influenced so much of today's American culture. But of course, we'll save that for the next episode. Isaac, once again, appreciate you coming on, and looking forward to episode 9.
Thank you for having me again. Hard to believe the series is already starting to wrap up, but it's been a good time, and I'm looking forward to doing these next 2 episodes.
Absolutely, man. Me too. That was Isaac Lawson once again on the Carving It Up U.S. President's Edition. And again, we are seeing how, and I think that we see this often, how presidents have, you can go all the way back to the man himself, George Washington, where we think we can avoid world issues, but especially now that we have become really the premier power in the world, we can't. And of course, we'll see that very early on in episode 9. But as Isaac said, man, it's crazy. We are close to the end of the series. We got one more episode. Episode 9, we'll of course talk about the last, our most recent 4 presidents. And then in episode 10, that's where the fun is. We'll give our own personal list of presidents. But until episode 9, appreciate everybody stopping by as always. Be sure to look out for Carving It Up, the Carving Up U.S. President's Edition, episode 9, a week after this one airs. So have a great day, everybody. Continue to stay safe out there. God bless you all. Peace out.